There are moments in life so small that most people never notice them. A glance across a crowded room, a quiet smile, a single word, the kind of moments that disappear almost as quickly as they arrive. But sometimes, those moments become turning points. On a cold autumn evening in Manhattan, one such moment unfolded inside a ballroom filled with some of the most powerful people in America. An elderly man sat alone while hundreds of people celebrated the success of his son. No one spoke to him. No one stopped beside his table. Most people barely noticed he was there. Yet within the next few minutes, a shy waitress would walk across the room, sign a single word, and unknowingly expose a painful truth that had been silently growing inside one of America's wealthiest families for years. A truth that would leave a billionaire questioning everything he thought he had given his father. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. His name was Samuel Carter. Most people in that room did not know who he was. Those who did recognized him only as the father of Ethan Carter, a billionaire entrepreneur whose success had become the subject of magazine covers, television interviews, and business conferences across the country. Ethan's rise from a modest upbringing to extraordinary wealth had inspired countless people. That evening's charity gala was being held in his honor. Hundreds had gathered to celebrate his accomplishments. Yet almost nobody noticed the elderly man seated alone near the back of the ballroom. Samuel Carter sat quietly with his hands folded in his lap. His silver hair was neatly combed. His suit was carefully pressed. His expression carried the calm dignity of a man who had spent decades working hard and asking for very little in return. Every few moments he looked around the room, watching conversations unfold around him. He could see people smiling. He could see laughter. He could see relationships forming and memories being made. But he could not hear any of it. Samuel was deaf. And for most of the evening, nobody spoke to him. Servers walked past his table. Guests passed by his chair. Old acquaintances nodded politely before moving on to more comfortable conversations. It wasn't cruelty. In many ways, that made it hurt even more. Nobody intended to ignore him. They simply found it easier to continue their evening than to make the effort to communicate. And so Samuel remained where he was, present but unseen, surrounded by hundreds of people, yet completely alone. What nobody realized was that Samuel had spent much of his life sacrificing for others. Long before Ethan Carter became a billionaire, before magazine covers and private jets and international recognition, there was a father working overtime shifts to keep food on the table. There was a father who believed that if he worked hard enough, his child would one day have opportunities he never had. For years, Samuel carried that responsibility without complaint. He celebrated every achievement Ethan earned. Yet as the years passed and Ethan's world expanded, the distance between father and son quietly grew. Neither of them noticed it at first. That night, Samuel had arrived hoping to spend time with his son. He wasn't interested in the speeches. He didn't care about the cameras. He wasn't impressed by the luxury surrounding him. He simply wanted to be close to family. Instead, he found himself sitting alone. As the evening continued, Ethan moved from table to table greeting investors, donors, and public figures. Everyone wanted a moment of his attention. Everyone wanted a photograph. Everyone wanted a conversation. And while Ethan smiled and thanked his guests, he never noticed the growing sadness in his father's eyes. Then something happened. Something so simple that most people would have dismissed it entirely. A young waitress carrying a tray of sparkling water paused as she walked through the ballroom. Her name was Emily Parker. At 24 years old, Emily was one of the newest employees at the venue. Quiet by nature, she often blended into the background. Guests rarely remembered her name. Many barely acknowledged her presence. Yet unlike most people in the room, Emily paid attention to details. She noticed who seemed uncomfortable. She noticed who looked lost. She noticed the expressions people tried to hide. And when her eyes landed on Samuel Carter, she noticed something everyone else had missed. For several seconds, she watched him carefully. She saw the way he studied people's lips. She saw the slight delay in his reactions. She saw the isolation. Then she understood. Emily's heart immediately tightened, because she recognized that loneliness. Years earlier, her younger brother had lost his hearing after a severe illness. Their family had spent years learning sign language together. At first it had been difficult. Then it became second nature. Eventually it became something even deeper. a bridge connecting people who refused to let silence create distance between them. Emily glanced around the room. Nobody seemed to be speaking with Samuel. Nobody seemed to know how. She hesitated, not because she was afraid of approaching him, but because she had no idea how he would respond. Then she set down her tray, took a slow breath, and walked toward his table. What happened over the next few minutes would leave guests speechless, force Ethan Carter to confront a truth he had been avoiding for years, and change the lives of everyone involved. As Emily approached the table, Samuel looked up, expecting another polite smile before being overlooked once again. Instead, the young waitress stopped directly in front of him. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Then Emily gently raised her hands and signed a single word. "Hello." The reaction was immediate. Samuel froze. The smile on his face vanished. His eyes widened. And for the first time that evening, someone truly saw him. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe. And let us know in the comments. Have you ever felt overlooked like Samuel? Because what happened after Emily signed that single word changed everything. Samuel stared at the young waitress for several seconds. His eyes moved from her face to her hands and back again, as if he were trying to convince himself he hadn't imagined what had just happened. Then Emily signed the word once more. "Hello." A smile slowly appeared on Samuel's face. Not the polite smile he had been wearing throughout the evening. Not the smile people use when they're trying to hide disappointment. This one was different. This one reached his eyes. For a brief moment, Samuel looked like a man 20 years younger. Emily smiled back. Then she signed another question. "How are you tonight?" Samuel let out a soft laugh. The kind of laugh that arrives unexpectedly after a long period of silence. He answered her immediately. "I'm better now." Emily couldn't help smiling. Simple as the exchange was, she could already see the difference in him. The loneliness that had surrounded him only moments earlier seemed to loosen its grip. His shoulders relaxed. His posture changed. Even his eyes appeared brighter. It was as though someone had finally opened a door after years of standing outside. For the next several minutes, the two spoke in sign language. At first, the conversation was simple. Emily asked how long he had been attending events like this. Samuel joked that he had attended enough charity galas to last 3 lifetimes. Emily laughed. Samuel laughed too. And before long, they were talking as though they had known each other for years. Across the room, people began noticing, not because they understood what was being said, but because of Samuel's reaction. For most of the evening, he had sat quietly by himself. Now he was smiling, laughing, engaged, alive. Several guests glanced toward the table. A few looked surprised. Others looked confused. One executive even turned to another and asked who the young woman was. No one seemed to have an answer. Meanwhile, Ethan Carter remained occupied with guests and donors. Yet even from the opposite side of the room, something eventually caught his attention. His father, smiling. At first, Ethan barely thought about it. Then he looked again. The smile remained. In fact, Samuel appeared happier than he had looked in years. That was when Ethan noticed the waitress sitting beside him. The two appeared deeply engaged in conversation, or at least as deeply engaged as two people could be while communicating entirely through sign language. Ethan frowned slightly. He hadn't known his father had met anyone at the event. Curious, he continued watching. The sight stirred something uncomfortable inside him. Not jealousy, not anger, something harder to define. Because as he watched his father communicate effortlessly with a complete stranger, a question quietly entered his mind. When was the last time I made him smile like that? The answer didn't come immediately, but the longer he thought about it, the more troubling the silence became. Back at the table, Emily asked Samuel how long he had been deaf. The old man's smile softened. Then he paused before answering. Almost 20 years. Emily's expression changed. 20 years. That was longer than she expected. Samuel nodded. Then he explained that his hearing hadn't disappeared overnight. It had faded little by little, year after year, conversation after conversation, until eventually the world became quieter than he ever imagined possible. Emily listened carefully. She knew the journey wasn't easy. She had watched her brother experience many of the same struggles. The frustration, the misunderstandings, the isolation. Yet there was something else in Samuel's expression. Something deeper. Something that had nothing to do with hearing loss itself. Emily noticed it immediately. Then she signed a question. A simple question, but one that caught Samuel completely off guard. Do people make enough effort to communicate with you? For the first time since their conversation began, Samuel didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted toward the crowded room, toward the guests, toward the stage, toward Ethan. Then he looked back at Emily and smiled sadly. It wasn't a bitter smile. It wasn't angry. If anything, it seemed filled with understanding, the kind that only comes after years of disappointment. Finally, he raised his hands and answered. Most people try it first. Emily nodded. Samuel continued. Then life gets busy. The words hung between them. Emily felt her chest tighten, because she knew there was more. Samuel lowered his gaze for a moment, then added something that would stay with her forever. Eventually, they stopped trying. The smile never left his face. Yet somehow that made the sentence even more heartbreaking. Emily didn't know what to say. She looked around the room again. Hundreds of people. Hundreds. Yet for most of the evening, Samuel had been completely alone. Not because nobody cared about him, but because caring and making time are not always the same thing. A person can be loved deeply and still feel forgotten. And Samuel Carter understood that better than anyone. Across the ballroom, Ethan finally excused himself from a conversation with a group of investors. Something about the exchange between his father and the waitress continued bothering him. Not because of the waitress, not because of his father, but because of what he was beginning to realize. For years he had assumed his father was happy. After all, Samuel never complained, never demanded attention, never asked for anything. Whenever Ethan apologized for being busy, Samuel always understood. Whenever plans were postponed, Samuel never argued. And perhaps that was the problem. People rarely investigate the pain that remains hidden. They only react to the pain they can see. Slowly, Ethan began walking toward his father's table. He had no idea what he was about to hear. He had no idea that a conversation lasting only a few minutes would force him to confront years of uncomfortable truths. And he certainly had no idea that the most important lesson of his entire life was about to come from a young waitress he had never even noticed before. Because while Ethan Carter had spent years building one of the most successful companies in America, he was about to discover something he had failed to build inside his own family. And once he understood it, there would be no way to forget it. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe. And tell us in the comments, do you think family relationships naturally drift apart over time, or should we always make time for the people we love? As Ethan moved through the crowd, he found himself watching his father more closely than he had all evening. The sight felt unfamiliar, not because Samuel had changed, but because Ethan was suddenly seeing him differently. For years, his father had existed in the background of his life, like a constant presence he never had to worry about. Samuel was always there, always understanding, always patient, always willing to adjust his schedule whenever Ethan's became too complicated. And somehow, over time, Ethan had mistaken that patience for happiness. The closer he came to the table, the more difficult it became to ignore the feeling growing inside him. Because the man laughing with Emily wasn't the father Ethan had seen during recent visits. This version of Samuel seemed lighter, more energetic, more engaged, as though someone had returned something that had been missing for years. When Ethan was still several feet away, he stopped. Neither Samuel nor Emily noticed him. They were too focused on their conversation. So Ethan remained where he was, watching, listening as best he could, trying to understand what made this interaction so different. A few moments later, Emily signed another question. What was your favorite part of raising Ethan? The answer came instantly. Samuel didn't need time to think. His eyes brightened immediately. A smile spread across his face. Everything about him changed. Watching him believe he could do anything. Emily smiled. Samuel continued. When he was young, he never thought about limitations. He chuckled softly. If he wanted to build something, he built it. If he wanted to learn something, he learned it. If he failed, he tried again. Emily could see the pride in every movement of his hands. There was no bitterness, no resentment, only admiration. The kind of admiration a parent carries for a child long after that child has grown. Then Emily asked another question, one she hadn't planned on asking, one that simply slipped out. Are you proud of him? Samuel looked almost surprised. Then he laughed, a genuine laugh. The answer seemed obvious to him. Proud. He shook his head. I'm amazed by him. The word struck Ethan harder than he expected. Standing several feet away, he felt his throat tighten. Because despite everything, despite the distance, despite the years that had passed, despite the calls he missed and the visits he postponed, his father still looked at him with the same pride he had carried when Ethan was a child. For a moment, Ethan remembered something he hadn't thought about in years. A winter evening. A broken-down pickup truck. A 10-year-old boy sitting beside his father. The heater barely worked. Money was tight. The future was uncertain. Yet Samuel had looked at him and said something Ethan never forgot. "One day you'll go farther than I ever could." At the time, Ethan thought it was encouragement. Now he realized it had also been a sacrifice. Because every parent knows that helping a child move forward often means being left behind. Emily noticed a change in Samuel's expression. His smile remained, but something else appeared beneath it. A sadness so faint most people would have missed it. She hesitated before asking her next question. Then she signed carefully. "Does Ethan know sign language?" The smile disappeared. Not completely, just enough. And for the first time that evening, Samuel looked away. The silence lasted several seconds. Long enough for Emily to realize she may have touched something painful. Finally, Samuel answered. "A little." Emily nodded, then waited. Samuel stared toward the stage where Ethan had spent most of the evening. A long time ago, he knew more. Emily's heart sank. The words weren't accusatory. They weren't angry. They were simply honest. And honesty often hurts more than blame. Samuel folded his hands together, then continued. "When I first lost my hearing, Ethan learned as much as he could. He practiced every day. He wanted to help." His smile returned briefly. He was good at it too. Emily listened carefully. Something in Samuel's expression told her there was more to the story. There just wasn't enough time after that. The sentence sounded simple, yet Emily understood exactly what he meant. Success had happened. Business had happened. Life had happened. And somewhere along the way, communication had become less frequent, then less comfortable, then less natural, until eventually it almost disappeared altogether. Samuel looked down at the table, then signed something so quietly that Emily nearly missed it. "I think we both stopped trying." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the chest, because he knew that wasn't true. His father had never stopped trying. Samuel still answered every text, still accepted every invitation, still rearranged his schedule whenever Ethan found time. The truth was much harder to face. Only one of them had stopped trying. And standing there among hundreds of guests, Ethan realized it had been him. For years he had convinced himself that success justified his absence, that providing financially was enough, that there would always be more time later, more weekends, more holidays, more conversations, but later had a habit of arriving much faster than expected. And suddenly Ethan found himself wondering how many opportunities he had already lost, how many stories he had never asked his father to tell, how many memories had quietly disappeared because he was too busy chasing the next achievement. For the first time all evening, Ethan wasn't thinking about investors. He wasn't thinking about donations. He wasn't thinking about business. He was thinking about an elderly man sitting a few feet away, a man who had spent his entire life helping him succeed, a man who now seemed more connected to a stranger than to his own son. And the realization was almost unbearable. Then Emily asked a question that neither she nor Samuel realized Ethan was standing close enough to witness. A question that would change everything. She looked directly at Samuel and sighed. "When was the last time you and Ethan had a real conversation?" Samuel froze. The smile faded. The laughter disappeared. And for several seconds, he didn't move at all. Because for the first time that evening, someone had asked the question he had spent years avoiding. And the answer was far more painful than anyone expected. Samuel's hands remained motionless above the table. For a moment, it seemed as though the question itself had transported him somewhere else. Not to the ballroom, not to the gala, but to a place filled with memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Emily immediately regretted asking. The sadness in Samuel's eyes told her she had touched something deeply personal, something that had been carried quietly for a very long time. Around them, the evening continued as though nothing had happened. Guests laughed. Servers moved between tables. Conversations carried on uninterrupted. Yet for Samuel Carter, the room suddenly felt very far away. He lowered his gaze, then slowly raised his hands. "I don't remember." Emily's heart sank. Samuel looked embarrassed after saying it, as though he felt responsible for the answer, as though forgetting somehow reflected a failure on his part. But the pain wasn't in the words themselves. It was in how quickly they came. There was no hesitation, no searching for a date, no attempt to recall a specific occasion, just a simple truth. He genuinely couldn't remember. And that truth landed heavily on Ethan. Standing only a few feet away, He felt the air leave his lungs. Because he could remember business meetings from 5 years ago. He could remember investment presentations, quarterly reports, contract negotiations, the names of executives he barely spoke to anymore. Yet when he tried to remember the last meaningful conversation he had shared with his father, his mind offered nothing. Only silence. Samuel stared at his hands, then added something else. He's always busy. The sentence wasn't bitter. If anything, it sounded protective. The way a father speaks when he doesn't want anyone criticizing his child. Emily nodded gently, but Samuel wasn't finished. He texts. Another pause. He checks on me. Another pause. He's a good man. Emily could see tears beginning to gather in the corners of his eyes. Not because he doubted those words, because he believed them. That was what made the situation so heartbreaking. Samuel wasn't sitting there feeling unloved. He was sitting there feeling disconnected. There is a difference. A person can love someone deeply and still drift away from them. Not through cruelty, not through anger, simply through neglect. The kind that happens one postponed visit at a time, one missed call at a time, one busy week becoming another, then another, then another. Across America, countless families experience the same thing every day. Relationships rarely collapse overnight. They fade quietly, so quietly that nobody notices until the distance has already become enormous. Samuel lifted his eyes again, then smiled sadly. You know what I miss most? Emily shook her head. Samuel looked around the room, at all the conversations happening around him. Then he answered, being included. The words were simple, yet they struck harder than anything he had said all evening. I don't need people to feel sorry for me. Emily listened carefully. I don't need special treatment. His smile faded. I just miss feeling like I'm part of things. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Because there was nothing to add. No advice. No easy solution. Just truth. And sometimes truth is impossible to argue with. Behind them, Ethan felt a growing pressure in his chest. A pressure built from years of moments he had ignored. Birthdays cut short by work calls. Family dinners canceled because meetings ran late. Holiday visits postponed until next month. Then postponed again. Every decision had seemed reasonable at the time. Each one had a logical explanation. Each one felt temporary. Yet standing there now, Ethan could finally see what those decisions had accumulated into. Distance. Years of it. Distance measured not in miles, but in moments. Moments he would never get back. Then Samuel did something unexpected. He laughed softly. The sound surprised Emily, because it seemed completely out of place. She looked at him curiously. Samuel shook his head. I remember teaching Ethan how to ride a bicycle. Emily smiled. The sudden change caught her off guard. Samuel's eyes brightened. He crashed into the same mailbox 3 times. Emily laughed. So did he eventually learn? Oh, he learned. Samuel grinned. He was stubborn. The smile remained on his face, then slowly began to fade. He always got back up. For a moment, Samuel seemed lost in the memory, watching it unfold somewhere behind his eyes. Then his expression changed. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something Emily hadn't heard before. Regret. I thought we'd have more time. Emily felt her heart tighten. The sentence was barely above a whisper. Yet somehow it echoed louder than everything else he had said. Samuel wasn't talking about death. He wasn't talking about illness. He was talking about life. The years that disappear before people realize they're disappearing. The conversations people assume can wait. The visits people promise themselves they'll make later. The relationships people believe will always be there. Until one day they realize later has become years. And years have become memories. At that moment, Ethan could no longer remain where he was. The weight of everything he had heard had become too much. Slowly, he stepped forward. Samuel noticed movement and turned. The instant he saw his son standing there, his eyes widened. Emily looked up as well. A sudden silence settled over the table. None of them spoke. None of them moved. Because all 3 understood something important had just happened. Ethan looked at his father. Really looked at him. Perhaps for the first time in years. And what he saw wasn't disappointment. It wasn't anger. It wasn't resentment. What he saw was something far worse. He saw a man who had already forgiven him. A man who had spent years making excuses on his behalf. A man who still loved him enough to protect him even while carrying his own loneliness. And in that moment, Ethan Carter felt more ashamed than he ever had in his entire life. Because success had taught him how to build companies, how to create wealth, how to influence people. But standing face to face with his father, he realized there was one thing he had failed to learn: how to make time for the people who mattered most. And what happened next would become the turning point not only of that evening, but of Ethan Carter's entire life. For several long seconds, neither father nor son moved. The noise of the gala continued around them. Guests chatted. Glasses clinked. Servers moved from table to table. Yet none of it seemed to matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was the distance that had existed between them for years, and the realization that neither of them wanted to carry it any longer. Ethan slowly pulled out the chair beside his father, then sat down. No phone, no assistants, no investors, no interruptions, just a son sitting beside his father. Samuel looked surprised, not because Ethan had joined him, but because it had happened without anyone asking, without anyone arranging it, without a schedule, without a reason. For a moment, neither knew what to say. Then Ethan did something nobody at the table expected. He raised his hands, awkwardly, slowly, like someone trying to remember a language he hadn't spoken in years. Samuel's eyes widened. Emily stared in silence. The movements weren't perfect. They weren't smooth. But Samuel understood immediately. Ethan was signing. The first sign took several attempts. The second came easier. Then finally, after years of silence between them, Ethan managed to form the words he should have spoken long ago. "I'm sorry." The moment the signs left his hands, Samuel froze. His eyes filled with tears, not because the apology erased the years, not because it solved everything, but because it meant his son finally understood. For years, Samuel had never wanted money, never wanted gifts, never wanted recognition. He only wanted connection. And for the first time in a very long while, that connection was returning. Tears rolled down Samuel's face. Ethan's eyes filled as well. The billionaire who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without hesitation suddenly struggled to maintain his composure. Because no business victory had ever felt as important as this moment. No achievement, no award, no accomplishment. Nothing compared to sitting beside the man who had given him everything. The two remained there talking long after the gala program ended. Emily quietly excused herself and returned to work, believing her role in the evening was finished. She had no idea that the small decision she made earlier would continue changing lives long after the event ended. For nearly 2 hours, father and son spoke. Sometimes through sign language. Sometimes through written notes. Sometimes through nothing more than shared smiles and memories. They talked about things neither had discussed in years. Stories from Ethan's childhood. Old family traditions. Dreams. Regrets. Moments both wished they could revisit. At one point, Samuel laughed so hard that tears streamed down his face. A sight Ethan realized he hadn't seen in far too long. And perhaps that was the greatest gift of the evening. Not the apology. Not the conversation. Not even the reconciliation. It was the laughter. The simple reminder that they still had time. Not unlimited time. Not guaranteed time. But time nonetheless. And that made all the difference. The following morning, Ethan canceled 3 meetings. His assistants thought it was a mistake. It wasn't. Instead, he drove to his father's house. A week later, he returned. The week after that, he came again. Slowly, new habits formed. Not because someone forced them to, because both men finally understood how precious those moments were. Months passed. Then something remarkable happened. Ethan enrolled in sign language classes. Privately. Without publicity. Without announcements. Without cameras. Twice a week. Then 3 times. Every lesson became another bridge connecting him to his father. Every new phrase made conversation easier. Every visit became longer. For the first time in years, Samuel no longer waited by the phone hoping his son might text. He knew he would. And perhaps more importantly, he knew Ethan wanted to. 6 months after the gala, the Carter Foundation held another event. Many of the same guests attended. The same donors. The same executives. The same influential figures. But this time something was different. Throughout the evening, Samuel was never alone. Not for a single moment. Whenever someone approached him, Ethan introduced them properly. Whenever conversations began, Ethan made sure his father was included. And whenever Samuel signed something, Ethan signed back. The guests noticed. Many were moved by it. Some even began learning basic sign language themselves. But the most meaningful moment came near the end of the evening, when Samuel spotted a familiar face across the room. Emily Parker. She had been invited as a special guest. At first, she looked uncomfortable being there. After all, she was still just a waitress trying to make ends meet. Yet Samuel immediately walked toward her, smiling, the same way he had smiled the night they first met. Before she could say anything, Samuel signed 3 simple words. "Thank you, Emily." Emily smiled, then shook her head, because in her mind, she hadn't done anything extraordinary. She had simply said hello. But that was the lesson hidden inside the entire story. Sometimes changing someone's life doesn't begin with a grand gesture. Sometimes it begins with noticing them, with listening, with making them feel included, with choosing to see someone others have overlooked. One conversation, one act of kindness, one word, hello. Years later, Ethan would often describe that gala as the most important night of his life. Not because of the donations raised, not because of the influential people he met, not because of the recognition he received, but because it forced him to confront a truth many people discover too late. Success means very little if you have nobody meaningful to share it with. The people who love us rarely ask for much. A phone call, a visit, a conversation, a little of our time. And yet those simple things often become the easiest to postpone. Samuel Carter spent years believing he had become invisible. It took a shy waitress and a single signed greeting to remind him that he wasn't. And it took that same moment to remind a billionaire that the most valuable investment he would ever make wasn't in a company. It was in the people who had stood beside him long before success arrived. So now we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever reconnected with someone you realized you had been taking for granted? Or is there someone in your life you should call today? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need the reminder. Because sometimes a single conversation can change everything.